Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 202, The Revelation of the Seven Seasons, Part 3. The podcast objectives are analyze the time of the great distress, analyze the purpose of the sifting of the nations, reveal how there will be no turning back once the sifting of the nations begins, and prove how the sifting of the nations will be a global event. This lesson contains timelines and other visuals. Therefore, if you are listening to the podcast, I advise you to watch the video version on our website or YouTube, or request a PDF of the lesson so you can add the visual effect. The Great Distress. Now, in the most recent podcast, we established the purpose of the sealing of the set apart ones, i.e., the second of the seven seasons in these last days. The purpose? To protect the renewed nation of Israel during the great confiscation. Here is why. In line with the parable of the darnel of the field, the messengers will remove the stumbling blocks and those doing lawlessness from the field of the world. This equates to approximately 6 billion men, women, and children, all of whom will perish for one reason. They do not possess the seal of Elohim. As you learned in the most recent podcast, the seal of Elohim is the sign the angels of death will look for as they determine who to kill and who to spare alive. This commencement marks the transition between the sealing of the set apart ones and the sifting of the nations. As you can see by the timeline below, the sifting of the nations is the third season in these last days. As we discussed aforetime, the sifting marks the beginning of the great confiscation, a violent time which the scriptures refer to as the great distress. Revelation 7:9-14 reveals, after this, I looked and saw a great crowd, which no one was able to count, out of all nations and tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, dressed in white robes and palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, deliverance belongs to our Elohim, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. And one of the elders responded, saying to me, who are these dressed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, Master, you know. And he said to me, these are those coming out of the great distress, having washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, here we have our first treasure box. The great distress in this passage is not the same as the Great Tribulation. These are two different end times events that occur at two different intervals. Now, we will thoroughly analyze the Great Distress and the Great Tribulation in future podcasts. At this time, you must understand how the sifting of the nations marks the beginning of the Great Distress. Great distress being the best depiction of our troubled world in those days. You must believe me. These last days will be extremely difficult, even for the chosen elect. And this will become very clear as I begin painting the picture of these last days with the word of truth. And you see clearly how and why 6 billion men, women, and children will die in only a few years. No turning back. Now, I know I have said this often before, but I want you to really think about this reality. Think about 6 billion men, women, and children dying in only a few years. When you go about your day, consider how 3 out of every 4 persons you see will not survive the great distress. It is indeed a sobering reality. Notwithstanding, we have the time and the power to do something about it. And thus, I hear the word of Elohim saying, if we should neglect so great a salvation, we are without excuse. This is especially the case for those of us who have been called. For the purpose of the sifting of the nations is clear. It is to initiate the removal of all the stumbling blocks and those doing lawlessness from the earth. It is the leading frame of the great distress. We know this because the timing is right. To wit, the chosen elect by this time have been restored and they have been sealed. And thus, the messengers sent to kill can begin sifting the earth in preparation for the millennial kingdom. Remember, this kingdom will be nothing like the world we live in today. Therefore, the messengers must remove all the elements contrary to the will of Elohim before the commencement of this kingdom. Truly, this is not some horror show. This is not some bloody exercise without a spiritual cause. The Father is simply extraditing those who, by their actions, have made it clear that they are not worthy of the millennial reign. They are not kingdom material. This is why I constantly speak to the urgency of this hour, and I will continue to do so. For once the sifting of the nations begins, every man's fate will be determined. All beds will have been made, and there will be no turning back. A global event. Now, an important facet of the sifting is the fact that it will be a global event, i.e., every nation will be sifted. Every nation will sustain losses. Every nation will be hit. Thus, there is nowhere you can run, nowhere you can hide to escape the judgment of that season. Jeremiah 25:15-33 reveals, thus said Yahuwah Elohim of Israel to me, take this wine cup of wrath from my hand and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. And they shall drink and shake and go mad because of the sword that I am sending among them. And you shall say to them, thus said Yahuwah of hosts, drink, be drunk, and vomit, fall and rise no more, because of the sword I am sending among you. And it shall be, when they refuse to take the cup from your hand to drink, then you shall say to them, thus said Yahuwah of hosts, you shall drink. For look, I am beginning to bring evil upon the city which is called by my name. And should you be entirely unpunished? You are not going unpunished, for I am calling for a sword on all the inhabitants of the earth declares Yahuwah of hosts. And you shall prophesy against them all these words, and say to them, Yahuwah roars from on high, and utters his voice from his set apart dwelling place. He roars mightily over his fold, a shout as those who tread the grapes against all the inhabitants of the earth. Tumult shall come to the ends of the earth, for Yahuwah has a controversy with the nations. He shall enter into judgment with all flesh. The wrong he shall give to the sword, declares Yahuwah. Thus said Yahuwah of hosts, see, evil is going forth from nation to nation, and a great whirlwind is raised up from the farthest parts of the earth. And in that day, the slain of Yahuwah shall be from one end of the earth, even to the other end of the earth. They shall not be lamented or gathered or buried, for they are dung on the face of the ground. This word of truth, offered to us by Jeremiah the prophet, is the foundational accounting of the sifting of the nations. As such, we will revisit this passage in future podcasts, proving how this prophecy will be manifested in these last days. What you need to know at this time is sure. The sifting of the nations is the beginning of many great sorrows. And although distress accurately describes what we will endure in those days, those who do not possess the seal of Elohim will endure something much worse. Now, here is the final word. The third step in surviving these last days is preparing yourself for the sifting of the nations. Obviously, the first step in this process is obtaining the seal of Elohim. For without the seal, you will not be guarded during the great distress. On the contrary, you will be designated by the angels of death as one set to be killed. However, obtaining the seal is not the end of the story, for the seal has requirements. At the highest level, these are spirit and truth. Therefore, if we are to survive this season, we must continue to walk in spirit and in truth. Remember, there will not be many safe spaces left in the world in those days, and we will not know where these safe spaces will be if we are not walking in the Spirit. For if we walk in the Spirit, he will reveal to us this truth. He will show us where the Father wants us to abide during the time of the great distress. Be not deceived, for Elohim is not mocked. The seal is not a spiritual license to do whatever you want and to be wherever you want to be, while fully expecting the Most High to protect you. Although many are of this false persuasion, they will find it was never true. And when the sifting begins, they will not be guarded, and there will be nothing they can do. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 202, the revelation of the seven seasons, part 3. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 204, the revelation of the seven seasons, part 4. I will post this podcast on July 24th, 2023. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim. Continue to watch. Continue to pray. Continue in fasting. And most of all, continue to be focused. For the end is coming. The end is near.